Welcome to this deep dive. We'll be exploring oneness.
Mhm.
You know that feeling of being connected to something bigger than yourself?
Yeah.
And you're looking for practical ways to bring that feeling into your everyday life.
Exactly.
We've got some pretty cool sources for this. We're going to look at neuroscience, a little bit of philosophy, even some stories from artists and chess players.
Sounds like a plan.
By the end, you'll have some solid steps you can actually use.
Awesome.
Let's jump right in.
Okay, so let's start with the brain. There's this research by Dr. Richard Davidson. He worked with people who do Vipassana meditation.
Okay.
And his findings were really interesting. He had these experienced meditators do a task, something stressful, and they showed way less stress than people who were new to meditation. Not only that, afterwards they had less inflammation.
Wow.
And get this, their cortisol levels were 13% lower.
13%. That's
Yeah.
huge.
Right.
So, if I meditate regularly, I could actually see real benefits, especially with stress.
Exactly. It's not just about handling stress, though. There's another study by Judson Brewer.
Right.
He found that even when experienced meditators were just resting, their brains were showing activity that looked like mindfulness
Right.
or, like loving kindness. But beginners, their brains didn't do that. So imagine with practice, you could actually shift your baseline state closer to oneness.
That's a pretty amazing thought. It makes me want to go meditate right now. But there's this idea of the fragmented self. It's talked about in the Embodied Mind.
Yeah.
And it kind of challenges the idea of a unified I, which is a big part of oneness, isn't it?
You're hitting on a key point. If we're all fragmented, how do we experience oneness? The Embodied Mind points to mindfulness awareness meditation. It's a Buddhist approach. It deals with that fragmentation. It has two stages, shamatha, that's about calming the mind, and vipassana, developing insight. Think of them as interwoven. You calm your mind to gain insights, and those insights further calm your mind. It's a dynamic process, something you can bring into everyday life.
Like a mindfulness dance.
Yeah.
Okay, so meditation helps us with our fragmentation. And then that opens us up to oneness. That makes sense.
Yeah.
But what about flow? Like Melly Csikszentmihalyi talks about in flow.
Yeah, flow, the psychology of optimal experience.
That's the one. It's about being totally absorbed in something, creating art, playing chess, even welding. Could that lead to oneness?
I think flow states can give us a glimpse of that feeling of being completely present, absorbed, which does line up with oneness, but there's a catch. These activities can become addictive. You can end up isolated from the real world. Think about those chess champions, Bobby Fischer.
Yeah.
They get so into the game, they lose touch with everything else. So
Yeah.
is that really oneness or just another kind of separation?
That's a good point. So flow can help, but we have to be careful. It can't be an escape. Speaking of connection, Csikszentmihalyi talks about how important relationships are.
For well-being, yeah.
Right. But we also need solitude. How do we balance those two?
Well, Csikszentmihalyi says we should consciously put energy into our relationships, like an investment. Think about it. The time, the effort, the emotions you put into those connections. It doesn't have to be grand gestures, even simple things like figuring out schedules together or, having the same reaction to a movie you're watching together.
Yeah.
Those small things can build oneness within your relationships.
It's the everyday stuff that matters, the small connections. I get it. Okay, let's switch gears for a second. Let's talk about God and the brain.
Interesting. Okay.
It's where neuroscience and spirituality meet. Andrew Newberg's book, Principles of Neurotheology, goes into this. There was a study at Baylor University.
Okay.
They found that people see God in 4 main ways: authoritarian, critical, distant, and benevolent. So maybe our brains shape how we see a higher power, which affects how we experience oneness with the divine.
Makes you think, doesn't it? How our brains literally shape our understanding.
Exactly. So how does our current state of mind, like our own perception of reality, play into this?
Great question. Newberg talks about something called primary epistemic states.
Okay.
It's basically how we see reality. Our everyday reality is one state, dreaming is another. They both feel real while we're in them.
Yeah, that's true.
So could our state of mind be shaping how we see reality? And therefore, our sense of oneness?
That's definitely something to think about. It's crazy to think that our brains actually shape how we see reality and how that ties into oneness.
It really is.
It's like we have so much power to cultivate that feeling just by understanding our own minds.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the most fascinating things I've found is how challenging experiences can actually be really transformative for oneness.
Oh, tell me more about that.
Well, in Altered Traits, Daniel Goleman talks about these Tibetan meditators. They're like super advanced. And they showed this unique brainwave pattern, super high gamma activity. And not just when they were meditating, but even at rest.
Wow. So their brains were kind of wired for oneness,
Yeah,
even in everyday life.
exactly. It suggests that consistent practice, meditation or whatever, can actually change your brain for good. But we don't need to go to extremes. Remember that chess player, Luchin?
Yeah.
Csikszentmihalyi talks about him in flow as a sort of warning.
Right.
He got so obsessed with chess that he kind of lost touch with reality.
Yeah, it's a good reminder. Even flow can become a problem if it leads to isolation.
Exactly. But here's the cool part. Csikszentmihalyi also says we can use those same flow activities to connect with others, like playing music together. When musicians are really in sync, they're not just playing notes, they're creating a shared experience.
A collective flow state.
Yeah.
So it's about finding those activities that let us connect with others on a deeper level, that shared purpose, that energy, beyond just being individuals.
Exactly. Which brings us back to relationships. Remember, Csikszentmihalyi talks about investing psychic energy in the people we care about. Just like we invest energy in any skill we want to master, he even says, just feeling the same emotions to something you're experiencing together, that can build oneness in a relationship.
That's so interesting. So like if I'm watching a movie with a friend and we both laugh at the same joke or we both feel moved by the same scene, we're actually strengthening our bond.
Exactly. It's those little moments of connection that can make a big difference. And it doesn't just have to be close relationships. You can bring that same feeling, that openness, to any interaction, even with strangers.
Like every interaction could be a little oneness experience.
Yeah, I like that.
Okay, but we haven't talked about the embodied mind too much.
True.
It really gets into how complex the self is. Fragmented, always changing.
Right.
Makes you wonder, how can we experience oneness if we're always in flux?
It's a great question. It's not as simple as flipping a switch. There's a process. Understanding, accepting that our identity is fluid. And that's where mindfulness is so powerful. It's not about reaching bliss or anything. It's about becoming aware of our thoughts, our feelings, our sensations, without judging them.
So we're not trying to force ourselves into some idea of oneness. We're just cultivating awareness. And that lets us experience oneness as it happens.
You got it. That's why that Buddhist approach to mindfulness is so helpful. Calming the mind, shamatha, and developing insight, vipassana.
Right.
Finding that balance between stillness and observation, acceptance and understanding.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see how it all fits together, but we haven't really talked about God.
The big question.
Right. Where does that fit into all this?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. In Principles of Neurotheology, Andrew Newberg tackles these big questions head on. He looks at how our brains shape our idea of God and how that affects our experience of oneness with the divine.
It makes you realize our personal experiences, even spiritual ones, are filtered through our own brains.
Exactly. It highlights how personal and subjective religious experience really is. And remember that Baylor study we talked about with the 4 God personalities.
Oh, yeah. Authoritarian, critical, distant, and benevolent.
Right. What's interesting is that these perceptions, they aren't tied to any particular religion. It really shows how much our brains shape our understanding of God, our relationship with the divine.
So my own sense of oneness with God is being shaped by my brain. That's kind of humbling. And empowering, too.
It is. And Newberg goes even further. He brings up those primary epistemic states again.
Oh, right, like waking and dreaming. Are you saying there are even more states than that?
Exactly. And the key thing is, whatever state we're in, our brains see that as true reality. So if someone's having a mystical experience, feeling totally one with the universe, their brain is interpreting that as reality at that moment.
So my experience of oneness, whether it's with God, with nature, or even with another person, it's all a product of how my brain is interpreting reality.
Exactly. That's why understanding our brains and how things like meditation can change them is so important for oneness. We're not just talking about abstract concepts here. We're talking about actual brain processes that we can learn to influence.
Wow, this has been quite a journey, from monks with crazy brainwaves to the nature of reality itself. And it all comes back to oneness.
It's all connected. That's what I love about looking at these sources together. We're weaving these different threads of knowledge, these different perspectives, to create a richer understanding.
Like creating a tapestry. It's bigger than all the individual parts, but I have to admit, my brain is starting to feel full.
I hear you. We've covered a lot, but there's still more to explore. Luckily, this is a 3-part deep dive.
That's right. So let's take a moment to process everything and then we'll dive back in for our final exploration of oneness.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into oneness, I'm curious, what's really stuck with you from all these sources?
It's really hit me how our brains aren't just like passive. They're actually shaping our reality, how we
Mm.
experience everything. It's like we have more power than we think to cultivate oneness
Hmm.
just by understanding how our minds work.
That's a great takeaway. And it links up with what the embodied mind is saying. Our experiences, like embodied.
Right.
It's not just the stuff in our heads, it's how we interact with the world through our bodies, our senses, our actions.
So it's not just thinking our way to oneness, it's about living it,
Yeah.
putting it into practice.
Exactly. And that's where mindfulness meditation comes in. It's not just about quieting the mind, it's about being aware of our sensations, emotions, the present moment. Like we're training ourselves to experience the world in a more whole way.
Yeah. It's like fine-tuning ourselves to pick up on those little connections, the ones that are always there, but we miss them in our busy lives.
I like that.
Remember those primary epistemic states from Andrew Newberg's book,
Mm.
Principles of Neurotheology?
Yeah.
He was saying we can shift between those states through meditation, prayer, even exercise.
Right. And what's cool is that certain activities can help us tap into the parts of ourselves that are already wired for connection, for oneness. It's like we have this whole spectrum of consciousness, and we just need to figure out how to access it.
Love that analogy. We've talked a lot about meditation,
Yeah.
but in flow, Csikszentmihalyi talks about how important strong relationships are.
Yeah.
It seems counterintuitive that something as simple as hanging out with people we care about could lead to oneness,
Mm.
especially since we also need solitude.
He gets that. He knows we need alone time. But he says investing in relationships is just as important as any other skill.
Right.
It's about making those connections a priority. And remember, those times when you feel deeply connected to others,
Yeah.
those are little oneness experiences.
It's the small stuff. Laughing
Yeah.
at the same joke,
Yeah.
feeling moved by the same song, even just being comfortable in silence with someone. Those can be the most powerful moments.
Absolutely. And it's not just about close relationships either. It's about bringing that same openness to all our interactions,
Yeah.
even with strangers.
Seeing that spark of humanity that connects us all.
Yeah, exactly.
So it sounds like oneness isn't just a state of mind. It's a way of being.
I like that.
It's approaching everything with that sense of openness and connection.
Beautifully said. And this brings us to something else. The ethical part of oneness. Remember how Newberg talked about how different parts of the brain are involved in moral reasoning?
Yeah.
He says understanding how our brains deal with those ethical dilemmas can actually help us understand theological concepts.
It's like this deep connection between our inner world, our relationships, even the divine. It's all part of this oneness tapestry, woven together by our experiences, our choices, our connections.
What a beautiful image. We've covered so much in this deep dive, from how the brain works to the vastness of spiritual experience.
It feels like we just scratched the surface. But I'm definitely leaving with a new sense of awe and a deeper appreciation for how we can experience oneness.
That's what it's all about. Remember, oneness isn't some mystical thing only a few people can reach. It's something we can cultivate. Right here, right now.
It's about making those choices moment by moment to connect with ourselves, with others, with the world around us. And we've seen there's so many ways to do that.
Exactly. And I hope you feel empowered to keep exploring your own path to oneness with everything we've learned from these sources.
This has been incredible. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into oneness. Until next time, may your journey be full of connection, meaning, and a sense of belonging.